Okay, my name's David Borden, and I'm the chairman of the Lobster Board. So we've got a number of items here that we're going to have to work through on the agenda. In terms of the agenda, we have distributed that, and I guess I have a question. Does anyone have a preference for moving an item so that they can catch a plane up? If not, then we'll take the items in which they appear. No hands up, so any objection to taking the items in the order that they were published? No objections. So the agenda is approved. Proceedings from the August meeting have been distributed. Are there any comments, additions, deletions to those? No hands up. Any objections to approving them? No objections. The proceedings are approved with unanimous consent. We afford the public an opportunity to address the board for issues that are not on the agenda. Are there any members of the public? No one signed up on the sign-up sheet, but are there any members of the public that would like that opportunity? If so, raise your hand. There are no hands up. Thank you. So we're into consideration of the draft addendum 25, and I'd like to just remind everyone that we've gone through a whole series of meetings here. We have adopted goals and objectives for this. At the last meeting, we tasked the PDT with putting together a series of alternatives. That information became available on the website on Thursday night, October 20th, and I would imagine that most of you didn't read it until either Friday or over the weekend or in the last few days. I'm sorry we couldn't get it out earlier, but that's just the way things were. What I'd like to do is I'd like to have Megan work through, give a presentation on the addendum, and then what I'd like to do is to talk about the timing of any action in terms of regulatory action and get some feedback from the states on what they think is a realistic timeline in order to implement the measures, that range of measures, not specific measures. Because I think that if we have that timing issue, it'll make some of the discussion on the addendum go smoother. In other words, if states can't implement this for this season, then in fact we have a little bit more time to refine the addendum. So with that as a little bit of background, Megan, would you like to work through the draft addendum, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be going through draft addendum 25, which we are considering for public comment today. I will note that there are two issues in the document. The first is the targeted increase in egg production for southern New England, and then the second issue is where those management measures should apply. And I'll go through each of those issues to hopefully set us up for a good discussion. So this is the timeline of the addendum. As David indicated, the board initiated this addendum in May to increase egg production and reduce fishing mortality in the southern New England stock. And in August, the board defined the goals and the management options for this addendum. And since that time, the PDT has been working on addendum 25. If it is approved for public comment today, our public comment period would be from November 2016 through January 2017. And then in February, we would review those public comments and consider final action. So the reason the board is taking management action is because the 2015 stock assessment found the southern New England stock is depleted with a reference abundance of 10 million lobsters, which is well below the threshold of 24 million lobsters. Abundance, spawning stock biomass, recruitment were all at historic lows, and model-free indicators corroborated these findings. As for spawning stock biomass, 6 out of the 8 surveys were below the 25th percentile. Furthermore, the survey encounter rate shows that the inshore population has contracted between 2008 and 2013. One of the largest indicators of the poor stock condition in southern New England has been the marked decline in recruitment. And I know we've shown this figure a couple of times, but I think it's really important to the document today. So on the x-axis, we have spawning stock biomass, and on the y-axis, we have recruitment. And what this shows is that overall, there is a positive trend between spawning stock biomass and recruitment. However, in the most recent years, we can see that it's more of a vertical trend, with recruitment dropping steadily and spawning stock biomass remaining steady. And this suggests that spawning stock biomass and recruitment are decoupled. There are several contributors to the poor condition in southern New England. The first is an increase in natural mortality. So climate change has had a significant impact on the stock, as lobster physiology is intricately tied to water temperature. This includes when eggs hatch and larval survivorship. So what you see here on the bottom of the screen, it's a figure of bottom water temperatures from eastern Long Island Sound, Connecticut. And it's the number of days above 20 degrees Celsius. And this was included in the stock assessment. But I'm showing it here just to show that real change that we've seen in the bottom temperatures and the stress that's being put on these lobsters. Another contributor to natural mortality is predation. So juvenile lobsters are an important source of food for many finfish species, and when those populations increase, pressure on the lobster stock also increases. In conjunction with an increase in natural mortality, continued fishing pressure has furthered the decline in southern New England. And the graph you've seen here, it was also included in a TC memo. But what it shows is that we have natural mortality in the dark black line there, and then we have catch in the green line. And this suggests that fishing mortality is still removing roughly twice as much spawning stock biomass from the population annually than natural mortality. If there's kind of a silver lining here, it's that this suggests management action can still have a real effect on the status of the stock. So given the poor condition of the stock, the board has initiated this addendum, and the goal for this addendum is recognizing the impact of climate change on the stock. The goal of Addendum 25 is to respond to the decline of the southern New England stock and its decline in recruitment, while preserving a functional portion of the lobster fishery in this area. Just as a reminder, the board is pursuing an increase in egg production so that if environmental conditions become favorable, we'll have enough eggs in the water to produce a successful and impactful recruitment event. Also, in setting the goal for this addendum, the board agreed that this is an initial management response to the stock assessment, and that the board will continue to monitor the stock and the fishery to determine the next appropriate course of action. So this here is a list of management tools that the board provided to the PDT at the August meeting. What I'm going to do is go through each one of these. I'll give a bit of background on the discussion had by both the PDT and the TC, and then the final recommendation of whether to consider this in the document or not. So I'm going to start with gauge size changes. Overall, the PDT had the greatest confidence in gauge size changes to create impactful changes to the southern New England stock. The PDT felt that changes to the minimum and maximum size are enforceable and provide a direct benefit of keeping lobsters in the water longer. Gauge size changes are also intricately tied to the biology of lobsters, with clear benefits in terms of egg production and fitness. And as a result, it is recommended for use in this management document. Analysis by the TC suggests that gauge size changes can achieve up to a 60% increase in egg production, with increases in the minimum size resulting in larger increases in egg production. The PDT did note that decreases in the maximum size do provide permanent protection for those larger lobsters. One of the things that the PDT discussed was the potential impact of gauge size changes, or really any of the action taken in this addendum, on interstate commerce. So as a result of this addendum, we might expect increased demand of lobsters from other LCMAs, especially those in the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank. And currently, the minimum and the maximum size are possession limits. And while this is very helpful for enforcement, it can also complicate interstate commerce, as lobsters legally caught in LCMA 1 have a smaller gauge size than those in southern New England. Some states, such as Connecticut and Rhode Island, have language that allows dealers to possess these lobsters caught in LCMA 1 as long as they're not sold to consumers in their state. And so the PDT does recommend that other states think about adopting similar language to try and get at this interstate commerce issue. Next, I'll move on to trap reductions. The PDT definitely had a lot of discussion on trap reductions, and I think the biggest challenge here is that the relationship between traps fished and fishing mortality is unclear and a bit tenuous. So currently, we are going through a series of allocation reductions in LCMAs 2 and 3, and the intent of that is to scale the size of the fishery to the size of the resource. I think an important part of that reduction is that it's trap allocation reductions, so that can reduce a fisherman's total trap allocation, including fish traps and latent effort. The TC did attempt to try and model the relationship between actively fished traps and exploitation rate to kind of try and get at what trap reductions might result in. And what they found is that a 25% reduction in the number of actively fished traps may result in at most a 13.1% increase in egg production. There are a lot of important caveats to this analysis that I want to highlight that suggest the actual increase in egg production might be a lot lower. The first is that the analysis assumes fishermen maintain a constant soak time, and we don't believe that this is true. As fishermen reduce the number of traps they have, they tend to increase the number of hauls they take to maintain that constant harvest level. Another important caveat here is that the analysis is based on active traps fished. And just as a reminder, those historic and current trap reductions we're taking include both actively fished traps and latent effort. So again, this is another way why this might not achieve that 13.1% increase. Finally, we have trap transferability in LCMAs 2 and 3, and this provides a mechanism for those fishermen to try and maintain their number of currently active fished traps. As a result of these many caveats, the PDT is recommending that trap reductions be used for management use in conjunction with gauge size changes. So trap reductions cannot be the sole management tool used in this addendum. We also looked at accelerated trap reductions, and so that would be looking at the effect of speeding up the current trap reductions in LCMAs 2 and 3. Given the TC's concerns that fishermen can reduce soak time, that current trap reductions can remove latent effort, and that fishermen have the ability to maintain the number of actively fished traps through transferability, the PDT is not recommending this tool for management use, as I don't believe it will create a meaningful increase in egg production. They also felt that this places a greater burden on LCMA 2 and 3 fishermen, and again, we're trying to address the entire southern New England stock here, not just a portion of it. Next, we'll discuss season closures. So the intent of this management tool is to reduce pressure on the stock at vulnerable times. And the biological benefit here is that it removes stress on lobsters as they're caught, handled, and hauled to the surface. Analysis by the TC, which is new and was done for this addendum, suggests that quarterly season closures can achieve up to a 21.6% increase in egg production, with the largest increases in egg production from summer closures, which is not surprising given that's when fishing mortality is highest. An important assumption here is that fishermen don't increase their effort during the open seasons to recoup their losses. And given this important caveat, the PDT is again recommending that season closures be used in this document in conjunction with gauge size changes. So season closures cannot be the sole management measure used to achieve the targeted increase in egg production. One of the important things to consider here is the impact on the Jonah crab fishery. So especially in southern New England, we're seeing the lobster fishery as more of a mixed crustacean fishery where fishermen can catch Jonah crab and lobsters using the same gear at different times of the year. And so I think an important thing to consider here is the potential impact of a closure on the Jonah crab fishery. Next is trip limits. So a trip limit is a management tool that is used in many other fisheries to maintain catch over a harvestable period of time and to potentially reduce exploitation. Some of the positives here are that trip limits are enforceable and they allow for the execution of both the lobster and the Jonah crab fishery. The PDT asked the TC for their comments and potential analysis on trip limits, and the TC came back with several concerns. The first was that given the difference in the size of vessels and capacity between the inshore and offshore fleet, the TC was concerned that trip limits may disproportionately impact the offshore fleet. There was also concern that fishermen might respond by increasing the number of trips they take to try and maintain their current harvest level. Kind of an unintended consequence of trip limits is that it may encourage those who currently harvest below that limit to increase their harvest. It's basically a goal that we've now set for them and that they might try and attain. And finally, trip limits may increase discards and stress. If you're limited to a certain number of lobsters, you may try and pick out the ones that you really want to bring in to sell. So with that, the TC recommended that trip limits be considered in conjunction with quotas. Quotas is a pretty large discussion here, and I think so the PDT discussed quotas a bit, and overall it can be an effective management tool if properly enforced. However, it's a pretty complicated discussion. It includes questions of how do you set the total allowable catch? How is that allocated either to individuals, jurisdictions, or LCMAs? There's also particular problems in the lobster fishery where we have some states who are landing lobsters from both southern New England and the Gulf of Maine stock, and so we'd have to deal with that. Given these complications, the TC is not recommending trip limits and quotas for inclusion in this addendum due to their complexity. The board has stated that this is an initial management response that's intended to be quick and decisive, and so I think if the board is interested in pursuing quotas, that should be a separate tasking for a separate document. Next, we'll move on to V-notching. V-notches are used to protect the reproductive females in the population, and currently some portions of the southern New England stock are doing mandatory V-notching. The value of the tool is predicated on high encounter and harvest rates, and given significant reductions in landings in southern New England, V-notching is not expected to produce a large benefit to the stock. V-notching in southern New England has also been hindered by some of the compliance issues, and as a result, it's not recommended for use in this document. Next, we have culls. So cull lobster is one that only has one claw, and currently culls can be legally landed in the fishery. So the PDT considered a prohibition on culls as a way to potentially reduce fishing mortality. One of the issues, though, is if we prohibit culls, it may encourage better handling practices, which really reduces the effectiveness of this management tool. Furthermore, if prohibited, there would have to be tolerances put in place in case a claw was lost during the steam back to port. And we'd also have to come up with a definition, since lobsters can regenerate their claws, and we'd need to deal with that issue. So as a result, culls are not recommended for management use in this document. Our final management tool we considered was standardizing regulations. So I think the TC has done a pretty good job of outlining the costs and benefits of this in a previous memo to the board. But just to sum that up, the benefits include improved enforcement and ease in the stock assessment process, where costs are cost of the fishery. It could create real winners and losers. During the PDT's discussion, they discussed that LCMAs were established to reflect the fact that there are different conditions in different portions of the fishery, and that the industry has really supported the use of different management tools through LCMTs. And as a result, the PDT will support standard regulations in the inshore fishery, meaning LCMAs 2, 4, 5, and 6, but not between the inshore and offshore fishery, so not between those inshore LCMAs and LCMA 3. I just want to clarify that standardized regulations are not required in this addendum. It's just that the PDT would support it if LCMAs and states were interested in that. All right, so now we move on to our second issue in this addendum, and that's where should these management tools apply? One of the great challenges in the lobster fishery is that our biological stock units do not match up with our management areas. And this is particularly a problem for LCMA 3. As you can see there in the light blue, it spans both the southern New England and the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank stock. And that dividing line there is the 70 west longitude line. Historically, actions we've taken in LCMA 3 or to address southern New England have occurred throughout Area 3. But given the potential severity of this addendum, the PDT thought that it might be best to consider ways to just have that apply to the southern New England portion of Area 3, given that the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank stock is at record high abundance and is not considered overfished, and overfishing is not occurring. So I just want to kind of orient people to this figure here because it's what I'll be discussing in the second issue. But again, we have that 70 west longitude line. The western portion there would be the southern New England portion, and the eastern portion will be the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank portion. So I'm going to go into the management options now. First, we'll start with the targeted increases in egg production. Option 1 is status quo, so there would be no management changes in southern New England. Option 2 is a 20% increase in egg production, and this can be achieved through gauge size changes, trap reductions, and season closures. Given the TC and the PDT's confidence in gauge size changes, those can be used on their own as a sole management tool in this addendum. However, given some of the caveats with trap reductions and season closures, those must be used in conjunction with gauge size changes. Furthermore, season closures and trap reductions cannot account for more than a 10% increase in egg production. The idea here is that we want to use the management tools we're most confident in, but we can be a little risky in that other percent of egg production we try and achieve. And you'll see for these management options, they all follow the same pattern, so that 10% increase in egg production is 50% of the target. So that's going to increase with each of the management targets. I'll try and point that out as we move along here. So option 3 is a 40% increase in egg production. Same story here. You can use gauge size changes, trap reductions, and season closures. Gauge size changes can be used on their own. However, trap reductions and season closures must be used in conjunction with gauge size changes. And together, season closures and trap reductions cannot account for more than 20% increase in egg production. Again, that would be 50% of the 40 target. And then option 4 is a 60% increase in in egg production. I'm not going to go through the specifics there. It's the same pattern, but hopefully everyone gets the general idea. This is table 9. I don't expect people to be able to read this, but if you want to look at the specific increases in egg production from gauge size changes, this is where to look. The intent here is that an LCMT or a state could look at these tables and say, all right, how do we want to achieve that 40% increase in egg production, for example, and you could go to these tables and pick out the various tools you might want to use. This is table 10 for the closed seasons. This is some of the new analysis for this addendum. Again, if you want to look at the specific increases in egg production for each season closure, please look there. All right, this is our second issue here, and again, we're trying to answer the question, where should these management tools apply? So option 1 is to maintain LCMA 3 as a single area. So the current boundaries of LCMA 3 would stay the same, and management measures in this addendum would apply to all LCMA 3 permit holders. Option 2 is to split LCMA 3 along the 70 west longitude line. So this is the line that I pointed out before that divides the southern New England portion of LCMA 3 from the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank portion. Annually, LCMA fishermen can elect to fish exclusively in that eastern or Georges Bank portion of the stock. Other LCMA-3 fishermen can fish throughout that area, but they are held to the stricter management measures of the two sections per the most restrictive rule. Trap tags would be amended to include 3E for 3 Eastern, and they can only be fished in the Eastern section or the Georges Bank section. LCMA-3 permits can still be transferred, but the recipient at the beginning of the fishing year would be able to either specify whether they want to fish throughout LCMA-3 or just exclusively in that Eastern Gulf of Maine Georges Bank portion. Most importantly, the management measures in this addendum would only apply to the western portion of LCMA-3, which again is that southern New England portion. And I'm going to pop this picture back up here just to clarify. So we have that 70 west line. In this option, the management measures would only apply in the area that says southern New England. The Gulf of Maine Georges Bank area would have the same regulations. Fishermen could choose to exclusively fish in that Gulf of Maine Georges Bank section, and their regulations wouldn't change. However, if a fisherman wants to fish in southern New England or southern New England and Georges Bank, then they're going to be held to the stricter of the two management measures. Finally, here we have some monitoring recommendations. So monitoring will be necessary to determine if the addendum meets its goals, as well as the need and extent of future management action. So our two recommendations are to monitor the exploitation rate and associated egg production of the southern New England stock, and a recommendation that model-free abundance indicators are updated each year as a part of the FMP review. And with that, I will take questions.
Okay, as I indicated before, we're going to take questions on what the PDT has fashioned, and I would prefer members of the board to not be advocating additional alternatives. This is just questions on what has been presented. Then what I want to do is talk briefly about the timing issue and what the board feels comfortable with, and depending upon I think there are a couple of alternatives there. Depending upon the alternative we pick, we'll either get into a very detailed discussion of the alternatives and any other potential alternatives, or there'll be another process that we'll follow. So questions on what, I've got a range. Mark Gibson, Dan Emerson.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. If you go back to the slide, I think on accelerated trap, if I remember, it was not recommended for a number of caveats, and I'm not understanding the logic of that. If there's a recommendation that trap reductions can be combined with gauge increases, why wouldn't accelerated trap reductions be able to be combined with that? Seemingly, you would get to your % reduction in exploitation and increase in egg production faster. So that I'm not understanding why this one is being ruled out and couldn't be used in combination.
So just to clarify, the trap reductions in this addendum are separate and in addition to the trap reductions that are currently taking place. So for example, if LCMA2 wanted to use trap reductions here, they would be in addition to the trap reductions that are currently happening.
I have Dan and then Emerson.
Thank you. I just had a question, Megan, on a comment you made about the states have possession laws governing lobster. I don't believe the possession laws is actually a requirement of the plan. In other words, in Massachusetts, we have laws pertaining to possession by the harvesters, but our minimum size in commerce is the smallest of the 3 minimum sizes I have in the state. We have very punitive laws governing the possession of short lobsters. It's $150 per lobster for criminally. And so I'm not sure that we want to repeat what you said. In other words, I think I want it on the record that states have the discretion to make it a possession law in their state or not.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. There is a sentence in the addendum that addresses Massachusetts regulations, so I can add that when I give the presentation.
Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Megan, for your excellent presentation. I got a question, Megan. It was your last slide, or your next to last slide, that mentioned monitoring egg production, and I'm just wondering who is going to be monitoring egg production, and how are they going to be doing that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really tricky to monitor egg production. So the current model that we use to get the analysis that are in this addendum, it relies on reductions in fishing mortality and then translate that to egg production. So that's why the recommendation is to monitor both the exploitation rate, and then through that model or simulation, we can try and get at egg production.
Emerson, follow-up?
Thank you. Okay, so that's just a number generated out of the model then. It's a calculated number based on some assumptions that are in the model, but based on reduction in fishing mortality. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't run the model, but that's my understanding as well.
David Simpson, and then Doug Grout.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Megan. That was very helpful. So my question relates to Table 10 and the season closures. There seems to be, wherein addendum was at 17, each LMA had a season closure table. This one is for use throughout southern New England, so I'm wondering how this might incorporate the 3-month closed season that we have in LMA 6 now. We're closed from September 6th to the end of November. Do we get 13.6% credit for closing December? How do we handle that? And the other curiosity is, if we closed all 4 seasons, we wouldn't get 100% reduction in exploitation, so maybe you could help me with that.
Yeah, so I'll try and tackle both of those. So the way that they got to this egg production number is through fishing mortality by quarter, and that comes out of, I believe, the stock assessment model. So that's why it's to all of southern New England, because that's as specific as that value gets in the stock assessment. It's from the 2015 stock assessment, so depending, I would have to check and see how your season closures influence that, but if that data or that change was incorporated into the 2015 assessment, I would think it might be reflected in this, but I would want to check with the TC. As to the other question, I also had that similar question, and so I think it has to more do with compounding effects, and the longer you get, the greater the increase will be. But I can try and provide a more robust answer for you if I talk with the TC.
David, follow-up?
Yeah, I think that would be really helpful, because if I look at it now and think we're already closed for basically the entire fall, and if we were to close July and August, my sense is for Long Island Sound that would represent a lot more than a 26% reduction in exploitation. So I want to make sure we're, when we go out to public hearing on this, we've got numbers that are realistic for our LMA.
Doug Grout.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is actually for our federal partners. I just want to confirm with them that this 70-degree line that would impact federal permit holders in fishing in Area 3, they don't see any conflict with any of the national standards in Magnuson in implementing this. You don't see any problem with that?
Peter, you want to respond, or Chip? Peter.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. With respect to the national standards, I'm not really quite sure, but I think just from we've certainly been able to administratively determine who's fishing where by them declaring that on their permit. So I see this as something similar to that, where somebody who's already qualified to fish their trap allocation in Area 3 to be able to voluntarily decide whether or not they want to be in either the eastern or the western part of it. But that's certainly something we'll have to look at in the context of this draft addendum.
Peter, can I follow up on that? How long would it, assuming that the board wants to consider that, how long will it take NOAA to put that into a rule? What's the time frame for that?
I'm assuming you mean all the measures that would be proposed in this addendum, right? So, well, our preference really would be to have something come out sooner rather than later, and if we could have a draft addendum that came forward today, I think that would help us. The more time we have to do our analysis and do our rulemaking process, the better. So I would say that if we could get something out today, that would be good. It would get the process started earlier. We'd be able to engage with the industry during this winter when they're more available to be able to focus their attention to it. So it might be difficult to get something in place certainly for the 2017 fishing year, but potentially for the 2018 fishing year if we could look at these measures and depending on the timing, try to get that through. We also have a new administration that's coming in this fall as well, so have to take that into consideration.
If I can just respond, so 2018 then you think is realistic?
We could try.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Michael, you?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I've answered my own question by reading more thoroughly a couple paragraphs in the document, but maybe, Megan, you can just confirm for me, under standardized regulations, the PDT is supporting standardizing the inshore regulations, but I'm assuming that we'd still be able to maintain differences between the LCMAs, and it's not just one complete standardized rule for all inshore LCMAs.
Yeah, that's correct. So right now, those LCMAs have the same gauge size, but they have different season closures. If that's something that, as a region, I'll say you wanted to maintain, that's allowed under this document. It's just a recommendation, not a requirement.
Questions on the part of the board? If not, I'll take a few questions from the audience. Anyone in the audience have questions on any of the provisions? If not, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. Megan, in terms of the closed season, did the PDT describe exactly what will take place during a closed season? I mean, this issue has come up before. Is it gear out of the water? Is it, what exactly takes place during a closed season?
I believe we discussed that a closed season is lobster traps out of the water.
I just point out to you that, and you know this, but I'm just saying, and so it's on the record, 50% of the income, almost $20 million worth of income, is generated by the crab fishery, which takes place at the same time the lobster fishery takes place. So I think we have to be, it's almost equal, if not a greater portion of the income for the fishery. So we have to be pretty clear in any public hearing exactly what's going to take place and what the impacts are. I think where we are at this stage, we've gone through the issue of questions. Let's focus just for a short period of time on the issue of timing. Peter already responded to the question of timing and basically told us what the federal agency could do. Given this array of management measures, none of us know exactly what would be implemented, but given the array of management measures, are all the states able to implement this under rulemaking, or do any of the states require legislative action? Do any states require legislative action to implement any of these? No. Okay, so my question to the board is, what is a realistic time frame for implementing this? Do you think it's realistic to try to implement this January 1st, 2017, or sometime before that or sometime after that. I'd like to get some comments. What did I say? Oh.
Yeah, Megan thought she might be able to do it a little quicker.
Yeah. Well, the way Megan described it, I think she was planning on adopting the final rule next week. Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got two things. First of all, I wanted to get this in earlier. On page 32, where it says under the first scenario, an 80-90 reduction in harvest is projected to stabilize the stock at current levels, and then it says, assuming natural mortality also stabilizes at current levels. And that particular statement there, I don't see as realistic, because I don't think natural mortality is going to stabilize. That was my point on that one, on page 32. And as far as timelines go, you have a system here where you've got fishermen fishing in Area 2, which includes state and federal waters, I believe. Now, if the state were to close state waters for a closed season, how do you keep, unless the feds come right along and do the same thing instantly, how do you keep those fishermen from moving and using their federal waters part for the traps that were in state waters of that area, and you close the season there so they all run out with the traps into another area where the feds would have to be controlled? I don't know how you do that, and this is part of the confusion and complications that this plan has.
I'll try my best on this one. My understanding is that during the last addendum with the 10%, most restrictive rule wins. So the state's rule, like the area closure, was implemented in state waters, ergo it was implemented in federal waters for those fishermen. I don't know if Pete wants to add to that or anyone else.
Peter?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, my understanding is that it would, someone who has a dual permit, a state or federal permit, would be subject to the more restrictive of the state or federal regulations in the meantime.
Okay, so any other comments, questions? So excuse me, Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On regards to the timeline, I think 2018 is fine from my standpoint. I don't know whether it's January 1st, 18 or the start of the lobster, the trap tag year. Perhaps that needs some discussion, but the only concern I have about that timeline would be, we have requests, as you know, from industry in different lobster management areas for LCMT input into this document before it goes out for public hearing. So I just wanted to make the board aware of that we will be looking to do that, and that might change the schedule that has been presented.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Mark. I mean, to me, I think that there's kind of a fundamental decision that the board has to make today. There are kind of two paths, I think, for the board to move forward. One of the paths would be to sit here, talk through all these different alternatives, and basically pass a motion to take alternatives out to public hearing as soon as possible. And that would mean that there would probably be some revisions to the document, and then Megan, we'd basically follow the schedule that Megan outlined. The second path, I think, because I've had a number of requests from industry similar to what Mark just pointed out, is to have a variation that slows down the process very slightly, and under that scenario, what I would envision doing is taking comments for, let's say, the month of November, and then forming a small subcommittee to review those comments with the staff, and then basically develop a memo which we would circulate to the entire board on the suggestions that have been brought forth, and then do a conference call on it subsequent to that. And then if the board agrees with the suggestions that are outlined in the memo, then we would refer that to the PDT and let them flesh out the rest of the management actions. If we did that, the timeline we would be on is to approve a public hearing document in February. So I think you've got a basic decision. Which one of those two paths does the board prefer to be on? I've spoken to a number of individuals and around the table, not all, but quite a few of you have said to me that you have not had adequate time to not only review the document, but to talk to members of your industry on it. So could I get some comments on which one of those two procedures you'd like to follow? Brandon?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I mean, I appreciate that we want to get industry's input on how we move forward, and I think we have the opportunity to do that, but the board started discussing moving forward with an addendum in May. In August, the board talked about all the different options that the PDT should consider, and I think the PDT has considered all of the options that are available for us to evaluate. I don't know what additional options industry is going to give us that are different than, gauge sizes, seasons, trap reductions. Those are the options available to us, and we've considered all of those. So I don't know what we're trying to get out of industry. I understand we want them to evaluate what we're proposing here and how that fits into what they want to do, but these are the options that are there. I don't see what going back at this point gains us in terms of additional things that we can consider. The TC's considered everything that we have available. The PDT has considered everything that we have available. So I think we have what we need to be able to move forward. Not that there aren't nuances that we need to figure out, but I think we have the tools here to make some decisions.
Other comments on it? Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's not as much about, for me, for Maryland, it's not as much about the industry, because I could pick up my cell phone right now and call the industry in about 5 minutes. I could call him. So, that's where we stand. For me, for us, it's more about when we implement the measures. Do we implement them in the middle of the summer, which is probably the timeline that we would be on? We have to wait for our legislative session to carry itself through to April. We wouldn't be able to put forth new rules until probably the middle of the summer, July or August. And if that were to be the case, we can certainly do it. I would prefer beginning new management measures at the beginning of a year, if at all possible. But I don't know how other states would feel about having an implementation date somewhere in the middle of the year. For me, it would be better to start at the beginning of a year rather than the middle of a year.
Other comments on this? Mark Gibson?
Yeah, thank you. To Brandon's points, I appreciate those points. I guess what I would say in return is that and I don't think industry, as you point out, is going to come up with some new unforeseen strategy, but they are challenging some of the assumptions that the technical committee and PDT have made relative to industry behavior in response to the different management measures. And I think we should afford them the opportunity to advance those arguments as to why they can't adjust their soak time to the extent that perhaps others have surmised they can, or switch their gear to other locations or times of seasons. So that's what we're hearing. So I would advocate the later timeline that you laid out.
Doug Grout.
So, Mr. Chairman, with the second scenario you laid out, you were talking about providing input, getting input that would be provided to a work group. And are you talking about soliciting input from industry, or is it something that commissioners would solicit and then bring back and provide that input?
My response to that is I don't see a big difference between just allowing anyone to comment and just allowing the commissioners to comment.
And how would you send this unapproved document out to the industry for consideration? Is that what you're proposing?
No, the document's already out. It's on the website. They have access to it. I think the point that Mark is making is the industry wants to comment on some aspects of the document before we authorize public hearings on it.
Okay.
Hey, hit the wrong button, Doug.
Thank you. I do that all the time. The final comment I'll make is to Mike's comment. No matter when we approve this document, whatever meeting, we still have to set an implementation date. You can approve it in May and have an implementation date of January 1. So we could conceivably move forward expeditiously, but then decide to wait until January 1, 2018 to implement.
Adam?
Thank you. The only question for me, really, and building on Doug's comment about the implementation date, the only question for me is whether this board believes the range of options in this document are within the realm of range of options that we're realistically going to consider whenever we do. If there are other options or something outside of this range, quite frankly, that's the only reason I see to delay getting this out into the hands of the public and officially getting their comment. If this is the range of all we're realistically going to consider, then I see no reason not to send this out. And again, when we actually implement it is at our discretion. I would argue the sooner we come up with regulations gives individual states more time to actually get those into final rules within the states themselves. But I think that's the question here today. Is this everything we're going to consider? If it is, we do it today. If it's not, then that would be reason for delaying the process.
I have David Simpson, Dan McKernan.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I think what some of us are feeling is a need to get more comfortable with this and the time that's required to do that, and whether we take a two-step process, which might be informational meetings as opposed to formal public hearings, or whether we go to formal public comment on this. I still have questions to resolve myself, and not the smallest of which is using that one table for season reductions. That just doesn't make sense to me yet, and I'd need to be more comfortable with that before going to public hearing. And I'm also wondering if we end up going down the road of considering trap reductions as a means of reducing exploitation. I'd like to know more about these tables and how much of a equal comparison, how comparable each state's individual trap numbers are to one another, especially traps reported fished. Everyone has different collection statistics, and I don't want to be held at a disadvantage by that. Looking at Table 5, it appears to me our number's off by 100,000 in terms of the number of traps that we have based on, prior commission actions, so I'm a little bit concerned there. And then I guess what we have is a technical committee recommendation that would require certain management actions to be paired with other ones. In other words, the technical committee is recommending that a closed season be paired with gauge changes, that trap reductions be paired with gauge adjustments. And while I feel like we've had some pretty good success in Long Island Sound with our achieving 10% reduction in exploitation with the fall closure, I think that it's pretty clear that all the work the technical committee's done on trap reductions and its relationship to exploitation They're taking pains to politely say it won't work. They're taking pains to say every analysis we've done says this won't work, and everything we know about fishing behavior says this won't work. But reading between the lines, you can see they're saying, but we know you want to do this anyway, so at least pair it with a gauge so we get something out of it. So I continue to be concerned about that. I mean, it's just crystal clear to me that if you consolidate traps into the hands of the most efficient operators, which is what would happen, who fish the most, the remaining concentrations of lobsters, you're not going to achieve a reduction in exploitation. You're going to make a few people comparatively wealthy at the expense of everyone else, and you won't achieve a reduction in exploitation. So, but I think that needs to get vetted out and talked about. I'm hearing things from Mark saying just the opposite, and from you that, oh no, they won't change their soak time, they won't change where the remaining traps fish. Well, of course they will. You know, so I remain to have that concern, and as I said, I'm concerned about the numbers of traps, and I need more help with that table, given that Long Island Sound already has a 3-month closed season. It simply can't be that if we close the rest of the year, we'd only get another 50% reduction.
I've got Dan McKernan.
Yeah, I'd be in favor of spending some time with the industry over the next month or two and then come back and approve this for hearing in February. One of the concerns that I have is we just got the document so recently, but it doesn't really describe the impact on the Jonah fishery. And we created a Jonah crab management plan over the last 2 years under the argument that the fishery has become a mixed crustacean fishery using traps, and yet this document doesn't really describe the impacts of a seasonal closure on Jonah landings. And I think that has value because we're going to have to figure that out. A closure versus a possession limit of 0 are two different things, and we might want to figure out a way to allow Jonah crab fishing, but it's really not captured in this document. So I'd be in favor of your latter proposal.
Thanks. I've got Jim Gilmore and then Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And being on the other side of Area 6, I'll echo some of Dave's concerns. But in addition to that, for lobster, it's one of the rare fisheries I manage where I do not have regulatory authority for everything. So things like gauge changes or some of the things of listings of our tools, I have to go through legislation to do this. So if I don't submit it today, forget about next year. So just wanted to let everyone know that when we get to the end of this, I have to hit the legislative process, which is typically September, October of each year, and have to go through that before I can even implement any of these. So that's going to be another complication in getting this thing done. So bottom line is, so the timing isn't, the whole thing isn't as important to me right now, because right now, if we concluded this today, it'd be probably a year before I could even implement it. Thank you.
Okay, Jim, and thank you very much for that point. That was exactly the reason I asked that question. I mean, what I'm sensing here is that there are interests that want to proceed as soon as possible, and I think it's important to do that. But I also share Mark Gibson's perspective that providing an opportunity for the board members in particular to write their questions, like David Simpson, write questions down, put those into some kind of format, have the PDT look at some of those types of questions and answer those questions, and then vote on the actions, I think is probably a more sensible way to proceed. So let me get down through the rest of my list. I've got Peter, Richie, and then Bill. Anyone else want, Emerson? Anyone else want to speak? John? Okay, and John. And then what I think I'll do is just ask to see a show of hands on the part of the delegations as to which path we want to proceed on. If we have a majority of individuals, then we'll proceed with the discussions accordingly. That agreeable to everyone? Okay, so next I've got Peter and then Richie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Certainly appreciate the comments from the various board members. I think NOAA Fisheries would certainly like to see this document go out today for public comment. To Adam's point, what other management measures could there possibly be? We had really an exhaustive list back in our August meeting trying to ask the board what types of measures we thought should be evaluated in this, and I think we gave a real comprehensive list of that, and I think the PDT took the information that they got from the technical committee and was able to really show which measures really were going to get to the goals of this addendum, which are really to increase egg production by decreasing fishing mortality. So just keep in mind that I think the intent of the board was really to take a definitive quick strike here to really get something out there that's going to have some teeth. Everything here is going to be tied in with a gauge increase, which is something that we can be able to monitor over time, which I think is very important for this fishery, since we're almost 2 years out now from the stock assessment, which showed that things aren't getting any better. So I would like to see it go out for public comment. I know that later on in the meeting we're also going to be talking about developing another addendum for improved reporting requirements and things like that. So that's another action potentially that's going to require the time of staff time here for the commission and also for the states and for NOAA Fisheries to analyze these options. So I'd like to be able to put this out for public comment, let the industry look at it in that context, and any of these other issues that come up can certainly be vetted during that period. Thank you.
Richie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have to agree with Peter and Adam. We've been fooling with this for 10 years. It's time we got to take some substantial action here. I don't believe we'll ever answer all the questions prior to starting the process. It's always going to be that we get back to the industry, they'll raise more things, we'll come back. You got to start it, and I think we'll get a lot of the input from industry and a lot of those questions answered during the process, and that's why we have that process. So let's get on with it.
Bill?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we will hear this basic statement that we've got a trap reduction going on now. I don't believe it's over, so there's still more reductions coming on traps. And I didn't know if when the technical group had looked at all these alternatives for trap reductions, et cetera, whether they already took into consideration what the current trap reduction program will achieve when it's over. And I don't know if they did that, or whether they just said, right now, this is where we are, and you'd have to go down this much in traps alone, trap reductions alone, in order to achieve X amount. And I didn't know if they already anticipated that the trap reductions, which are still ongoing, are doing something, because what you'll hear at public hearing is, we've already done work. That's what you'll hear. And there needs to be some response to that whenever we go out to public hearing. And okay, I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Bill, the answer to your question, when the center analyzed the impacts of the trap reduction, they only analyzed the first 25% cut, which we implemented last May 1st. They have not analyzed the second 25% cut.
Okay, so in other words, there's another trap reduction coming already, and they haven't analyzed whether that cut into perhaps what they wanted to do with a trap reduction. They haven't analyzed that, apparently, that part. Because in other words, they may already have achieved something, I guess, when they're finished with the existing trap reductions. They may have already achieved some of what we're looking for. I know it's not all, but okay.
Yeah, I just note I've got an email someplace from Burton that basically says that. Yes. Okay, let's see, I've got Emerson, John, and then David Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two things. One is I'm unclear what the role is of the LCMTs in this process, or what their role is anymore. It seems to me like they haven't interacted in the development at all. They haven't or provided any input to the development of this addendum. So are the LCMTs still in existence? Have they been dissolved? Do they need to be reconstituted? I'm wondering what the role is, again, of the LCMTs and how they are going to interact with this process. I think that if they are still in existence, there should be a more formal process with them rather than just saying to them, come to the public hearing when it comes to your state. So for that reason, I think that we might want to delay this so that we could codify their input. And the other is, and it may be a little bit late for this, but and I guess I could put this together in a response to whatever committee might be formed if this is delayed. What's the benefit in terms of egg production at removing ghost gear? You know, we've already removed 16,000 abandoned lobster pots out of Long Island Sound. There's 3 or 4 times that amount still, just in Long Island Sound, and there's gear elsewhere. And Dan, I think you mentioned the other day about a ghost lobster pot program that or an analysis or something. So I don't know if we can get at some level of increased egg production by removing ghost gear, and how that might factor into this. So those are my 2 issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Emerson. I've got John, and then David Simpson, then Pat Kelleher and Renee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, Roy pointed out to me that we are another state that would have to go through legislation to change to meet most of the possible options in the plan here. In terms of whether to delay or go right out to public comment, I think there's not much of a problem for Delaware either way. If the TC projections are correct, this addendum will likely just delay the date of commercial extinction of this stock. So I don't see that spending a few more months to get a little more input is really going to harm things here. So I think if we would like to get some input from, like Mike, we have very few lobstermen, but so very simple to get their input on some of these before we bring this back up in the winter. We wouldn't have a problem with that.
Yeah, thanks. I guess this should have been a question for Megan earlier, but the gauge size tables, that memo refers to just inshore and offshore. Historically, we've done it by LMA, but I also recognize that unless New York's been doing a lot of sea sampling, we don't have LMA 6 size composition anymore. The fishery reached a point, and lack of funding basically caused us to end our sea sampling program. So what is inshore and what is offshore for these tables? Because we know there'll be differential impact, but I'm not clear what inshore means here.
Yeah, so the heading for Table 9, it says that inshore is LCMAs 2, 4, 5, and 6, and offshore is LCMA 3. So if it's clearer, I can add that to the actual box there. But that's what the heading says. I just thought I might address some of the points that have come up, because I think there's a bit of confusion on LCMTs and trap reduction analysis, so I just kind of wanted to address that. For the LCMTs, Emerson, so how traditionally they've been engaged is, from my understanding, the 10% reduction, they were involved, in creating proposals on how they wanted to achieve that, and also kind of during that public comment period, I will say. So the LCMTs are separate from the commission. We don't run those. Those are industry run, and they are they're run by the states. So the commission is not involved in their running, but we do receive their comments and their proposals. For the trap reduction analysis, Bill, just to answer your question on like what percentage of current trap reductions are being included in this, I think the really tricky part of that question, and it's a great question, is that to understand the tipping point between reductions in latent effort and that tipping into reductions in actively fished traps is different for each fisherman, and it's really hard to predict. And so the big difference between the historical trap reductions and the analysis by the TC is that those historical trap reductions are based on total trap allocations, which includes latent effort. The analysis by the TC just looks at active trap reductions. And so I think that's the big difference there.
So related, we're talking about reasons for delaying, and I'm not trying to delay, but one of the things we don't have was actually Peter's suggestion, which I think was the last one added to the list, which was trip limits and quotas. And I think I'm looking down the road fully believing that we're going to have to end up there if we're actually, if we're going to make substantial progress in reducing F. So I don't want to, in this addendum, create irreversible harm to the industry without accomplishing much on the way to trap limits. So that is the one piece that I would like to, know more about. And certainly, if there's not agreement that we should wait for that information, then I just want to make sure we're flexible in this enough in this addendum in terms of must pair this with that, that we do no harm in this addendum. While, in other words, I think having already started on a season closure track and seen fishermen adjust to finding other things to do during those times, I'm thinking that's what we would pursue. But a gauge increase will be counterproductive. It will make them more inefficient. It will be disproportionately burdensome on Long Island Sound, which has smaller lobsters than Area 2, 4, 5. So, just keeping those things in mind. And there was something you said at the end that prompted me. I'll think of it and I'll have to come back to it.
Okay. Pat Kelleher and then Renee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Whether there is a delay or not, I personally think input from industry on a lot of this is always beneficial. The one thing that continues to nag at me and looking at the report is the fact that we still have this potential commerce issue if gauge size is going to be utilized. And I'm wondering, while we're gathering additional input from industry, that we shouldn't also get some input from legal to ensure that we're not going to go down the road of a problem with commerce and interstate commerce.
Okay, Renee.
I can only speak to Maine's ability to enforce a trap limit in Area 3. And right now with the equipment that we have, we wouldn't be effective in enforcing a trap limit in Area 3. We just don't have the equipment to do that. And so if it's not enforceable, if you have any trap reduction at this point would just be a suggestion, because it's not an enforceable thing realistically.
David.
Sorry, I'm trying very hard not to be a pest. It was actively fished traps. You mentioned actively fished traps, and could you explain how that was defined for each state? Again, I think that's a key, it's an extremely important point, and I think it varies by state. So I'd like to understand it.
So the number of actively fished traps was from the 2015 stock assessment. I don't have that table number in front of me, but I could look it up and email it to you really quick. But what the heading reads is that it's the number of traps reported fished by state in the Southern New England stock unit.
Could I follow up? And what does that mean? Who reported them and how? And is it the number of tags that were purchased? What is that?
I would have to ask the TC.
I think it's an important detail because I suspect it varies widely by state based on the information, the type of information they collect. I know that we have a mechanism for calculating how many traps a fisherman must have been fishing to explain his number of traps hauled and his set over days, and it's a complicated thing that requires us to follow a fisherman day after day after day. I suspect not everyone did that, and if we're comparing that against how many tags were sold, there are fishermen who for years have bought their tags and not used them for this day, for this very purpose right here.
Just a couple of comments. One of the things that's a bit tricky about talking about active and latent traps is we've had qualifying timelines and qualifying criteria that have differed in the different LMAs. In Area 2, they used the qualifying timeline of 2001 to 2003, and then basically the traps that the individuals were allocated were based on their landings during that period of time. In terms of Area 4 and 5 and 3, NOAA, and Peter, you can correct this if I misstate it, but NOAA used very different criteria. In Area 3, they used the criteria was you had to prove that you had 25,000 pounds of landings in 1 year and fished 200 traps. And then I think in Area 4 and 5, it was the same criteria minus the 25,000 pound landing limit. So there's been a variety of criteria used to actually qualify the trap allocations, but it was all based on performance in those areas. Okay, so any other comments, statements, questions? Mike, and then Peter, and then Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just make a quick comment. It sounds to me like you're still looking for some input on whether or not we put this forth to the public today or perhaps delay it until the winter meeting to finalize it. And like John, I really could go either way. I don't have much of a stake in it, given the nature of the fishery in Maryland, but it sounds to me like implementation, given some of the legislative and other issues that we're going to be facing as states, will likely not have implementation until 2018 for these actions. It's just the way that, from what I've heard. So if I had a bigger stake and I had concerns in the draft as it stands right now, as some of my colleagues from the north do, and I were asking for a delay so that I could fold in more comment from my stakeholders, I would hope the board would go forward with that request. So, you know, I'm willing to support a delay of a few months. I'm also thinking about Megan too, because we just finished up the PID from hell yesterday with Menhaden, and so she's going to have quite a winter, and this may give her a little time so Christmas isn't ruined. Just my thoughts. So I can go either way, but likely leaning towards whatever colleagues from the northern states are asking for.
All right, I'm going to recognize Peter, and then I just want to make a brief comment. Then I'm going to take like a 1-minute break so you can talk among your delegation. And then I'd like to see a show of hands so we get a sense of what the preference of the committee is. And what I'm trying to do is avoid a motion and then a whole range of motions to amend and so forth. Peter, and then
Thanks,
Brandon.
Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Just to put a finer point on what you said, David, I think that in the document, the technical committee did provide an analysis on active traps, the best way that they could characterize that, given the disparity in how that information is collected. And we talked about that at the PDT meeting, and we said we've already gone through this. The commission is already qualified and allocated in the various areas, and we don't want to get into a situation where we have to do that again based on what we think now is active as opposed to what the historical allocations are. And we've really worked hard to, along with the states, to try to pair up dual permit holders who had state and federal allocations. So we've already crossed that point. I don't think we want to go back there again. So I think the board can look at this draft addendum and realize that some level of active and latent effort is going to be taken out with any kind of trap reductions. What that amount is, it's going to be difficult to say. In the meantime, we also have the trap transfer program that can allow people to buy more traps and activate those traps. So as we move forward, it's kind of a dynamic process and difficult to pinpoint that. But I think what we came away with from that at the PDT meetings was that the TC's analysis was really just kind of a guideline of what's in there, and not necessarily the real-time number, but just something to give the board some kind of a baseline as a reference. The other thing I want to point out is that this document does a good job of giving it does constrain the choices to specific management measures, but it also gives the flexibility to each LCMA or LCMT to decide how they want to break that up and use that depending on how their fishery works. And I think that's to David Simpson's point, that there will be some flexibility there. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all once the board decides what percentage reduction would come from this. So anyway, thank you.
And you get the last comment?
Yeah, I certainly appreciate that board members want to get additional input from their industry. I wholly get that. But I think the purpose is to try to gain some clarity in terms of, how active trap, numbers are calculated, how these seasonal changes are going to impact things. But I don't think we're going to get any additional clarity on any of those things. The TC has spent years doing a lot of analysis, and they've provided the best information that the data isn't clear, and we're not going to get it any clearer by trying to evaluate it anymore, because there is no consistency among states in terms of how they determine what an active trap is or determining what latent effort is. The seasonal changes here, there isn't enough data to break it down spatially to evaluate what the true reductions are going to be at a smaller scale than across the entire southern New England stock. So, I understand the need and the want to get additional information from industry on it, but again, I think it's to seek clarity, but I think it's going to be clarity that we're not going to get.
Okay, so on Terry Stockwell.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of order for the record. I'm sitting at the table on behalf of the New England Fishery Management Councils, so I will be abstaining on all issues that are not council business.
Thanks, Terry. Okay, so what I would like to do is get some clarity on the timing of this. So you get two options. One option is we basically proceed today to agree to make a motion and basically put forth a motion to take this document or a variation of the document out to public hearing. Under the second option, we would take some comments, and then at the February meeting, the board would authorize public hearings. We'd have public hearings in early spring, and then adopt the final document, plan addendum, excuse me, at the May meeting for implementation as soon as possible. A personal comment is I don't see a tremendous amount of difference between these two timelines. From the discussion and comments that different board members have made, the document is not going to get implemented in 2017, or at least 2016. It might get implemented early in 2017, and may even be delayed on the part of some states if they require legislative action to a date past that. So, I'm not trying to sway votes one way or another, but I think the second option still gets the job done with sufficient time to implement it. So I'm going to let you have a 1-minute caucus, and then I'm going to ask for hands on which jurisdictions favor option 1 and which favor option 2. 1 minute. Richie?
Just have a question as to process. There's nothing in our procedure that would not allow us to have 2 public hearings on an addendum. So we could start the process now and have a public hearing and then have input come back from that. And if we felt that that was substantial enough to change the document up and go back out to public hearing a second time.
Yeah, that's true.
So we could basically do what you're asking to do, but do it in the formal process of the commission and in the and having the public participate fully. And it would also send the message that we're starting something. We're starting something today. So that would just be a suggestion of something we could do.
All right, so Brandon.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to hold up the vote or however we're proceeding here, but I do think, in talking with Adam, I think we may be missing a step that we need to consider in the timeline, because say we agree for this to go out, we take input on the document, and at February, the board will agree to a 0 to 60% increase in egg production. But then you're going to have to go back to the LCMTs to craft measures that are going to achieve that reduction. That's going to have to come back to the board at another meeting to evaluate whether or not those different, that's my assumption, you're going to create seasons and gauge changes and all those things combined for the different LCMTs. That will have to come back to the board for their evaluation to see if it meets the required whatever increase in egg production the board decides to do, and then the states will then have to go back and implement those measures to ensure that once they're approved that they meet those required reductions. I think there's another meeting where those final actions are going to have to take place for states to get those things in place, unless I'm wrong about that, but I think that's something else we need to consider.
All right, I think we've had enough discussion on this. Let me see a show of hands. All those that favor proceeding under the timeline in option 1, raise your hand. 1, 2. So I have 3 votes. All those that favor operating under timeline 2, raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8. Okay, so it's option. We're going to proceed under option 2. So let me just ask, we've had a good long discussion. I think we originally set aside about an hour for this agenda item. Is there any other points that individuals want to make at this time? If so, I'll allow a few comments. If not, I'll outline again the process so everyone is clear on what the process is. Any other comments? Anyone in the audience want to make a comment? Yeah, Peter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly respect the vote, but I think Brandon brought up a very important point, that this is not just choosing the measures and then moving forward and everyone goes back to their office and implements these regulations. It's going to have to require some engagement with the industry and maybe some complicated meetings about how we're going to implement this. So I hope that we can stay on our timeline.
Bill Adler, and please let's not re-argue the points. Bill, and I don't mean that in a prejudicial manner, Bill.
I think that since we basically thought option 2 was good, I think it's imperative that the states take this time to say to their industry and any other, come up with their questions or clearing some of the question marks they have, not to just sit there, but you could almost say, have a meeting with industry and say, this isn't an approved for public hearing yet, but this is what we're looking at. Any suggestions? Because we're going to approve it probably for official public hearing, let's say in February. So this way, don't wait till February to start something. To start it now, I know that the Massachusetts Lobstermen's Association will be having their winter meeting in January in Falmouth. and it would be a perfect opportunity, for instance, to have an open session there and get some ideas, at least from the Massachusetts and probably Rhode Island area on this stuff. So it's not that you sit quietly until February.
We can issue flak vests to the individuals that go to the meeting. Adam.
Well, building on that comment, I'll go one step further and ask that staff provide a date today when they need feedback on if the intent here is that this document is not sufficient, staff needs feedback to take to the PDT to craft a revised document. Let's get a date when they need that feedback by.
What I suggested when I outlined what I thought the steps would be under that venue, what I would say is any comments would have to be in prior to the end of the month of November. That would give the individuals around the table basically 30 days to consult with anyone you want to consult with, talk to your staff, talk to members of the industry, whatever, but the letters have to be into Megan prior to the end of November. Does anybody disagree with that? Okay, so Adam's point is spot on. You have a deadline. And then once we get those, what I intend to do is to have a very small subcommittee, like one representative from the Mid and one from New England, work with myself and Megan. We'll craft a memo that kind of summarizes any of the suggestions and tries to group them. And then we'll send all of the suggestions and a memo from the small subcommittee out to everyone as soon as we can do that. And then following that, we'll probably have a conference call to see whether or not there's a consensus to move some of those items to the PDT. Is that agreeable, that timeline? Okay, if it is, then I think that concludes the discussion on this. We got a plan of attack, we've got deadlines, we've got tasks. So let's move on to the next agenda item. I got to find my agenda. All right, so we're on discussion of trap cap, and just as a reminder, NOAA previously notified us that they had suspended their rulemaking on addendum 21 and 23 until there was greater clarity on the issue. Megan's going to provide a report on the meeting that took place on this, and then I'm going to make a couple of suggestions. Megan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm going to be reviewing a conference call that we had to discuss the trap caps included in Addenda 21 and 22. Just for a little bit of reminder and background on what was proposed and established in Addenda 21 and 22, it proposed and established a series of trap caps. So we have active trap caps, which is the number of traps you can fish, and individual ownership caps, which is the number of traps you can own. And what you'll see from the table up here is that the number of traps you can own is always greater than the number of traps you can fish, and this results in something that we typically call trap banking. Something else that was established in Addenda 21 and 22 is the series of reductions for both the active trap cap and the individual ownership cap in LCMA 3. So as David mentioned, NOAA sent a letter to the board saying that it has suspended their rulemaking process for federal trap caps and banking. And this is due to the poor condition of the southern New England stock and our current work on Addendum 25. It appears that significant management action in the area may take place. And with so much uncertainty, NOAA felt it was imprudent to continue the rulemaking process for these addenda, given that they may encourage fishermen to invest significant funds in a fishery that could be severely restricted in the future. So on September 7th, we had a call to discuss trap caps and banking in the lobster fishery. Participants on this call included commissioners, NOAA representatives, PDT members, and fishermen. I'll go over some of the highlights of that call. So industry members supported federal implementation of trap caps and banking. Some members stated that the conservation benefit of having traps which can't be fished tied to a permit. Others noted that the implementation delay has affected industry's ability to make future business decisions. NOAA reiterated its concern that trap banking encourages fishermen to invest in a fishery in poor condition, and they did express greater concern with implementing the individual ownership caps rather than the annual reductions in the LCMA3 active trap cap. Overall, I think one of the themes of this call was the growing disconnect between state and federal regulations. So in the Commission's addenda, we're proposing a series of reductions for the active and individual ownership cap in Area 3, and that's currently not in the federal regulation. So as time goes on, that difference gets larger and larger. So I think moving forward, there are a couple of options for the board. One option is that the board could recommend NOAA implement the active trap cap for LCMA 3. This would help to align state and federal regulations for the active trap cap in LCMA 3, and this action reduces fishing effort commensurate with the annual trap reductions currently in place. On the other hand, the board could revisit the issue in spring of 2017 after we have a better idea of what might happen with Addenda 25 and take a more holistic view to this issue. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, I'll try to cut through this. From an industry perspective, there's a lot of concern about this disconnect between the federal plan and the ASMFC plan, basically because of the suspension of the rules. In Area 3, we end up leaving somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 traps more per year get fished out there because of this disconnect. So I think it's important to straighten that out. Having said that, I also think it's important, the point that the NOAA staff has made is important. They want some certainty that that these programs match up and complement each other. So my suggestion is that we not take any action on this today. Basically, put it on the agenda for the spring meeting when we will be finalizing the Southern New England plan. At that point, NOAA will know exactly what the restrictions are going to be in Southern New England, and after we adopt the Southern New England plan, then we would revisit this issue at that same meeting and decide whether or not we want to continue ask them to implement these measures. I mean, to me, that's a logical way to proceed. So comments on that suggestion? If I don't see hands up, I'm going to ask whether there are any objections. Comments? Peter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just so I'm understanding it correctly, would that be that in the spring you'd look at whether you'd be requesting NOAA Fisheries to implement the active trap cap or all the banking and other aggregate trap cap elements of those two addenda?
I think all of there are a number of different provisions, as you know, that the Commission has already adopted and implemented, and I think all of those would be on the table for that discussion. And then if we want all of them to be implemented, we would recommend that. If we only want a few of them implemented, but to my way of thinking, that way NOAA will know exactly what the restrictions are and what we're recommending at that time. Those two link up. So any objections to doing that? If not, that item will be scheduled for the spring meeting. Okay, so we're going to move on. Next item on the agenda is the work group report. Megan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will be going over a report from the Lobster Reporting Work Group. So just a reminder as to how we started this discussion on reporting. In February of 2016, As a part of a TC memo, the TC highlighted data deficiencies in the lobster fishery, and particularly they were referencing some data deficiencies in federal waters. As a result, the board requested NOAA implement 100% trip-level reporting for all federally licensed fishermen. And in response, NOAA recommended that the board follow the addendum process to address these data concerns and allow for public participation in that process. Since then, there have been several issues which have really highlighted the data deficiencies in the lobster fishery, not just only in federal waters, but really throughout the entire coast. And these include the designation of the marine monument, ongoing coral protection, offshore wind. All of these management issues are asking for information on where the fishery is occurring and its value. And it's highlighting that we need improved harvester data with greater spatial resolution to respond to these management issues. So at the August meeting, the board convened a lobster reporting work group, and we had our meeting September 26th in Gloucester, Massachusetts. It was attended by commissioners, TC members, GARFO representatives, state data specialists, industry members, and ASCFC. And we discussed a couple of things. We discussed temporal and spatial deficiencies in the lobster fishery, the prevalence or lack thereof of electronic reporting, the percentage of harvester reporting, and the collection of biological data as it pertains to the stock assessment. And from that discussion, the group came up with a series of 5 goals. The first is to improve spatial resolution of harvester reporting. The second is utilize the latest technology to improve and increase reporting. The third is collect greater effort data in harvester reports. Fourth is define an inshore versus offshore area. And the fifth was proactively address the data concerns of the Atlantic large whale take reduction team. To achieve these goals, the work group came up with a series of recommendations, and they're split up into short-term, intermediate, and long-term recommendations. We have 2 short-term recommendations. The first is that Maine's 10% harvester reporting only include commercial license holders who have actively fished in the past 2 years. Currently, recreational license holders are included in that 10% of fishermen who are selected to report, and removing non-commercial fishermen from the sampling pool will ensure the greatest amount of harvester data is collected through that current program. Another short-term recommendation is to define inshore as 0 to 3 miles offshore, nearshore as 3 to 12 miles, and offshore as greater than 12 miles. Currently, there is no definition of inshore versus offshore in this fishery, and it poses some problems, especially when the board tasks the TC to analyze differences in the inshore versus offshore areas. Currently, what the TC does is they assign a statistical area to either inshore or offshore, and it's an imperfect system as some statistical areas are quite large and they include both inshore and offshore areas. For intermediate recommendations, we're recommending that there be 100% active harvester reporting for all state and federally permitted fishermen. Resource-limited states should, at a minimum, require reporting from a statistically valid sample of fishermen. And in 2007, the TC did some analysis on this, and they concluded that's 30% of active harvesters. We have asked the TC to revisit this to make sure that that percentage still holds, but that was the recommendation in 2007. There's also a recommendation to add data components to harvester reporting, including number of trap hauls, soak time, catch disposition, gear configuration, number of vertical lines, LCMA, and depth. States are collecting a variety of this information, but it's not uniform across all states. And a lot of this information would be really useful to collect. So number of trap hauls and soak time is important effort data. Gear configuration and number of vertical lines is important for large whale take reduction teams. And LCMA and depth is important to tell us where the fishery is occurring. Our final intermediate recommendation is to further delineate NIMS stat areas over harvester reports. So statistical areas are a really important basis of the stock assessment, but they're too broad to provide the spatial resolution needed to answer a lot of the management questions we have. And so a recommendation from this work group is to, at a minimum, delineate inshore, nearshore, and offshore areas in a statistical area. However, it could be taken a step further by breaking down a statistical area into smaller boxes and having a harvester check off which boxes he's fishing in. Finally, we have our long-term recommendations. The first one is to establish an electronic swipe card system for harvester and dealer reports. So currently, swipe cards are used in the Maine elver and urchin fisheries and the Massachusetts shellfish fishery. Dealers swipe harvester cards during a transaction, and they're unable to complete that transaction if reporting or permits are not current. So some of the benefits of this swipe card system are ease of dealer reporting, quick linking of harvester and dealer reports, pre-programmed fisherman information to reduce data entry mistakes, and ensuring compliance during reporting. Another recommendation is to incorporate VMS or other locator beacon to all lobster vessels. So again, this is trying to allow for greater spatial resolution in the fishery, and this includes not only where traps are being set, but also important transit routes to the fishery. And finally, there's a recommendation to establish an electronic fixed gear VTR for all federal permit holders. So one of the challenges right now with the VTR is that it's for all gear types. And so it's really hard to ask specific questions in regards to fixed gear or trap fisheries. And so there's a recommendation to create a VTR form that would just be for fixed gears. This would be electronic in nature, so it could only be filled out online. But the idea here is that this would allow for more data collection that's pertinent to the lobster fishery. The LEC also discussed some of this, so I'll pass it over to Renee to discuss this.
Renee?
As far as the VMS requirements, the LE is recommending that this happens sooner rather than later for all Area 3 vessels. Like I talked earlier, we really don't have the equipment, all the technology right now to enforce a trap limit offshore, which is where everything is going, is to trap limits to increase egg production or wherever else we want to go with it. So that's where the LE committee was with VMS.
All right, thanks, Renee. Megan? Questions?
That's it. We can take questions.
All right, so questions for Megan? Any questions on this? Anyone in the audience? Question? Pat?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is actually for Renee, just for clarification. You mentioned Area 3, but wasn't the VMS for offshore areas within Area 1 as well?
Yes, I guess I misspoke. Most of our issues right now, the enforcement issues that we've had in Maine anyway, have been in Area 1. So a VMS component for Area 1 federal lobster permits would be a good thing for us.
Yeah, Pat, as a follow-up, as I indicated early on, it would be my intent, and I think we should do this as a routine matter, to have the enforcement committee look at the proposals that are going to be incorporated into the public hearing document and give us advice specifically on that issue. Again, I mean, this has come up at 2 LEC meetings that or at least 3 LEC meetings that I've attended, but it's changed a little bit since the first time they discussed it. But I think the point is they're going to get another bite at it, and they can flesh out exactly what they think should be incorporated into the public hearing document. Pat?
That sounds really good, Mr. Chairman. I think what's critical here is that we're meshing both the LE committee and the reporting committee's advice, because I think we've got an opportunity to have technology that will help us both on the reporting side for regulatory compliance as well as the enforcement side. So I think these two things potentially can have the ability to talk to each other. Yeah,
and just a follow-up on these suggestions, I don't think that the board needs to take any action on them today, but just factor these recommendations in as you look at the plan. If you think, for instance, I think the first suggestion there was a Maine suggestion. If the state of Maine wants that option included in the public hearing document, it's a very simple thing to add that in and take it out to public hearing, and then at least we'll start the process of solving some of these problems. Doug, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did, Mr. Chairman. One thing that I want the board to consider, or at least to take into consideration with this, with VMS, is one, when we were talking about Area 3 boats, I fully support that. I think that's a great idea. As we bring it into the inshore fishery in Area 1, there are a number of people that fish in very, very small boats that a VMS may not be something that is feasible right now, given the power requirements for it. I think we're going to have to think about this from a functionality, the feasibility of being able to apply this to every boat in the inshore area before we start moving down this road.
Yeah, I agree with Doug's concerns. I think from my perspective, I think we would be looking at any boat or any vessel that's fishing in Area 3, not any small vessels fishing in near coastal, near shore environments.
Yeah. Anyone else on this point? Oh, okay. So just everyone be clear that this is something we want you to consider, and if New Hampshire and Maine want to trade emails on that, on how it would be placed in effect in nearshore Maine, I think that would be helpful. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to catch up and do a little homework on VMS, and according to the NOAA website, it's saying that typically a vessel gets reported once an hour for their location. For me, I'm always wary of Big Brother and my constituents being tracked. I'm just curious, is it going to be in real time, this proposal, or is it using the NOAA standard, which is once an hour?
Renee, do you want to comment? Has the enforcement committee discussed that?
We did discuss that. VMS is not the answer for the enforcement problems. It's a step in the right direction. It is once an hour that they report a scallop boat. Any boat that has a federal scallop permit, they're once every half hour. In an hour, you can haul a lot of trawls. What the fishery is becoming, just to give you a little example, what we're running into now is trawls that are set offshore with no buoys. That eliminates any need for lobster trap tags or anything like that. These are impossible for enforcement to find without some sort of tracking capabilities. Once an hour isn't going to do it for us, but it's a step in the right direction. And how they retrieve this, I'm sure a lot of people in the room are saying, why would anybody set them without the buoys? That must be a nightmare. But you can haul gear quicker with no buoys on it than you can with the buoys on it, because you don't have end lines. And how they set these is they set a head trap with and then 100 fathom of float line with a toggle in the middle of the float line, and they can cross that hump in the water going 10 knots, throw the grapple over with 20 fathom on it, and get that every time. They can haul that up really quick. We have one in the process right now. We're prosecuting a person right now that's doing that. And the information that we get from a lot of people is that this is becoming more and more prevalent out there, just to circumvent trap limits.
I would offer the thought that the next time the LEC discusses this issue, it'd be very useful to have the appropriate personnel from NOAA there, not only their enforcement people, but the VMS staff to attend and provide guidance. Any other business on this issue? Okay, so factor this into your recommendations that you're going to bring forth. We're going to move along to Jonah Crab. I'm going to let Megan do the introduction. We have a couple of motions that were postponed from the prior meeting. We'll put those up. I'm going to give you a suggestion on how to handle them in a fairly expedient manner, and then we'll proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we're going over Jonah Crab, Draft Addendum 2 for consideration for public comment today. So just a reminder, the board did see this document in August, but we delayed public comment for a couple of reasons. There was a request for additional management options in the document, particularly in regards to claw harvest. And there was also an issue raised over the lack of definition of bycatch in the fishery. And as a result, the board established a Jonah Crab working group to try and get at some of these issues. So this is our timeline for this addendum. Today we're reviewing the addendum for public comment, and if it is approved, our public comment period will be from November 2016 through January 2017, and then we would consider final action in February. So just a reminder as to the current claw provision, the Jonah Crab FMP establishes a whole crab fishery, with the exception of individuals from New Jersey through Virginia, who can prove a history of claw landings before June 2nd, 2015. And this was to account for the historic Delmarva claw fishery, which is typically executed by small boat fishermen who either have small capacity boats or don't have refrigeration on board. After final action on the Jonah Crab FMP, there were two problems that came up. The first was that claw fishermen from New York and Maine were identified, and currently these fishermen are limited to whole crabs, so there's concerns about equity in this fishery. Another potential problem is that NOAA has stated there are potential challenges implementing the regulation in federal waters, and specifically National Standard 4 requires management measures not discriminate between residents of different states. So I'm going to jump right into the data that the work group discussed, because I think that this is really the key for the changes that were made. So this was a graph that was included in the original version of the addendum. It looks at male morphometric data with carapace width on the x-axis and claw length on the y-axis. And this is from claws that were measured by MassDMF, both in southern New England and Georges Bank. And what we can see here is that a male crab whose carapace width meets the minimum size of 4 3/4 inches, we would expect to have a claw length of 2.47 inches. We can look at the same data for female crabs. So again, we have carapace width on the x-axis and claw length on the y-axis. And what we can see here is with that same relationship, if we look at the minimum size of 4 3/4 inches, we would expect a female crab to have a claw length of 2.06 inches, so clearly a little bit smaller than the male crabs. But I think more importantly, what this shows is that of the hundreds of female crabs that have been sampled, 100% have been had a claw length less than 2.75 inches. So there hasn't been a single female crab sampled that a claw length greater than 2.75 inches, and that's going to be an important fact for the changes made. So going back to the Jonah Crab work group discussion, on that call there were several concerns with a claw fishery in general. And these included that it might undermine the current minimum size, and also it allows for the potential harvest from egg-bearing females. So currently we have a prohibition on the harvest of egg-bearing females, but there could be a way in the claw fishery to try and undermine that. But kind of the solution we came to here is that by increasing the minimum claw size to 2.75 inches, this protects the female population, so the buried crabs, and provides a bit more cushion to that minimum size. And really, this is a higher standard for claws that are harvested or detached at sea. So I'm going to jump right into the management options. Option A is status quo. This has not changed. Again, this would be a whole crab fishery with the exception of individuals who can prove a history before the control date in the states of New Jersey through Virginia. Option B also has not changed. This is for a coast-wide whole crab fishery. So only whole crabs may be retained and sold coast-wide, and once landed, claws may be detached from the whole crab and sold. This is option C, and this has been the modified option in this document. So this allows for claw harvest coastwide. So claws may be detached and harvested at sea if they meet the minimum claw length of 2.75 inches. So again, this is a larger claw length size than originally proposed, and this is to protect those egg-bearing females and also to provide a bit more cushion to the minimum size. 2 claws may be harvested from the same crab, and the bycatch limits would still remain in Addendum 1. So if an individual is limited to the 1,000 crab bycatch limit, they would be limited to a 2,000 claw limit. Fishermen can also harvest whole crabs, which meet the minimum size of 4.75 inches, and once landed, claws can be detached from these whole crabs and sold. So I'm going to roll right into the second issue here, and then we can just discuss this all at the end. So there was also an issue brought up about bycatch in the fishery. Originally, the FMP established a 200 crab per day, 500 crab per trip bycatch limit for non-trap gear. But this was increased in Addendum 1 to 1,000 crabs, and it was also expanded to include non-lobster trap gear. These limits were intended to account for incidental catch, but no definition of bycatch was provided. And what this means is it allows for a small-scale fishery to develop, where a fisherman could go out, harvest 1,000 crabs, and nothing else for the day. And this really does not reflect the intention of the bycatch limit, which is to account for Jonah crab caught while targeting other species. So the Jonah crab work group is proposing that a second issue be added to this addendum. So it would be to consider a definition of bycatch in the fishery. Option A would be status quo, so there would be no definition of bycatch in the Jonah crab fishery, and fishermen who use non-trap gear or non-lobster trap gear could land Jonah crab up to the bycatch limit without having any other species on board. Option B is to have bycatch defined as a % composition. So under this option, Jonah crab caught under the incidental bycatch limit must comprise at all times during a fishing trip an amount lower in pounds than the species the deployed gear is targeting. The LEC also discussed this Jonah crab addendum in their meeting, so I'll pass it over to Renee to sum up their report.
Renee?
So when the LEC met, they realized, we agreed that there was a fishery that was occurring, that it was just a claw fishery, and we thought that a 5-gallon pail of crab claws would be allowed, and I guess everybody on the committee agreed to that.
Okay, Megan?
That's the end of my report. I'll take questions.
Okay, so questions for Megan or Renee on either one of those issues? Anyone? Any questions? In terms of the motions, could you put up the postpone motion, please? This was motion 5, is that what it was? Megan?
I don't remember the specific number, to be honest. But it was postponed to this meeting, so it's on the table for today's meeting.
Okay, so comments on the table. Anyone would care to comment on this? Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there was something in the water in Alexandria in August. This is like the second or third motion I've had to consider just pulling off this week. I think what we've addressed this motion through the working group, which I think was a great thing for this board to suggest. We've dealt with the claw fishery. We've dealt with some of this volumetric concern that we had, and I'll look to you for some advice on what to do here, whether we can withdraw the motion and just move forward with the addendum as it's currently written. I'd be happy to do that.
My preference, Mike, would be for someone to make a motion to postpone indefinitely. That'll kill it. Good. Yeah? Mark Gibson, Dan?
So moved to postpone indefinitely.
Okay. Jim, you want to second that? Seconded by Jim Gilmore. Any discussion on it? No hands up. Anyone in the audience care to comment? No hands up. Any objections to approving this by unanimous consent? It stands approved. Yes, Doug.
Just before we get to potentially approving this for public comment, there was one issue that I saw in this that I thought maybe we should try and consider adding a sentence in, and this is just to make sure we're on the same page, is to have a definition of how states would measure a claw length in the document so that we're all on that same page.
Pat Kelleher to that point? Okay, so Doug's made a suggestion. Anyone disagree with that? Remember, this is just a public hearing document, so the staff would craft a definition and basically include it in the document. No objections? There are no objections, so we'll do it with unanimous consent. Pat Kelleher.
So the motion to postpone, I couldn't even quickly figure out what that meant, but I had drafted a motion under 3.0 to get to a volumetric measure for retaining claws. We don't want to be in the business of measuring crab claws. And I have a motion, if Amy could put it up on the board, that would, I move to add option D under 3.0 management measures. Claw harvest permitted coastwide under this option. Claws may be detached and harvested, but may not exceed a volumetric limit of 5 gallons. And if I get a second, I'll give some additional information.
We have a motion. Is there a second? Anyone? No hand. Jim Gilmore, second. Discussion, Pat.
So Renee Cloutier, the major, and I took a very scientific approach to this. Renee went down, picked up a tote of crabs. It's 120 in a level packed tote. That tote equated to a 5-gallon bucket of crabs. We're talking about a 5-gallon bucket of claws. Harvesters are not retaining small crabs because that equates to a small claw. And we're looking for a very simple, what I believe is a very simple fix to allowing a very small amount of claws to be retained. So if somebody wants to, the way I would envision this rolling out, at least in Maine, would be that we would have a rule that says if you're not going to retain, if you're going to retain claws, you would not be able to retain a whole crab. So you would have to detach and just keep the claws. And again, we're talking about we're talking 120 crabs a day when you could harvest unlimited.
All right, so we have a motion second. Further discussion on this? Anyone? Yeah, Megan.
Just a clarifying question, Pat. Is there a minimum size with this claw limit, or it's claws of all lengths?
There would be no minimum size. We don't want to be measuring claws, but again, people aren't taking off small claws because there's no meat, no sense.
All right, so Dan.
With all due respect, I'm not sure that this language captures just what I heard Pat say. I think it needs to say may be detached, and if there are detached claws on the vessel, whole crabs may not be retained. You just said something that's not captured in that motion, so I think you need to rework the motion.
Pat, do you want to perfect your motion?
Yeah, I get...
How about this? We'll take a 5-minute break. How's that? And anyone that needs to use a restroom, please do so now, because we're going to go right through the rest of the agenda as soon as we come back. 5-minute break. Everyone have a seat, please. All right, Pat, have you perfected the motion the way you want?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, but Tony has now pointed out to me we may have an issue. My thinking was that a jurisdiction would be able to choose one or the other for their state. Tony has indicated that that now may be an issue of having two different sets of rules, and maybe she should comment on that before we go any further.
Let me ask Jim Gilmore. Jim, do you agree with the perfection of the language? But you want to hear the discussion. Okay. Tony?
As Pat has explained to me on the break, that he was thinking that we could, each state could choose of different options that were within this claw-only section of the document. And my one concern, and I guess it would be a question to Allie or Peter, is that if Maine federal water fishermen were fishing on one rule and Maryland federal water fishermen were fishing on another rule, both Area 3 fishermen, NOAA would have to choose one of those two rules. And so having inconsistent set of regulations could be problematic for those federal water fishermen.
Allie, you want to comment, or Peter?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think Tony is right. Having states all pick their own measures for this certainly creates a lot of complications for us. And my understanding of the addendum was to, pick one option to be used coast-wide, or at least that's what all of the options in the document were for previously. So,
Mike, and then Richie. Mike? Oh, Richie, you're up.
Well, if the 2,000 was adopted, 5-gallon buckets a lot less than 2,000, so that boat would just be more conservative. So if the 2,000 was enforced offshore, the vessel would have to make sure that that he had good-sized crabs if he wasn't measuring them. So,
Doug Grout, and then Pat.
The way I looked at this is this would be similar to a conservation equivalency within a plan. You have one state that wants to have 2,000 crab claws, but and the minimum size that is implemented in the plan. What the state of Maine was looking for was relief from having to have a minimum size, but they were going to drastically reduce by, I think, about an eighth the amount of claws. I could see where a scenario, because I believe there's some plans that the feds recognize conservation equivalency between the states. But I could see this working out where the federal agencies would implement the 2,000 pound and minimum size, but within the state of Maine, or say in the state of New Hampshire, we would implement something, a much smaller trip limit on it, but would not be enforcing the minimum size. The only problem we'd run into is if there was a Coast Guard vessel out there that would start measuring claws on federally permitted vessels at sea.
Bob?
I wonder if we could create be very creative in how we worded this, which is that if you have more than 5 gallons of claws, you can't retain any claws less than 2.5 inches. So So there's a threshold of 5 gallons. And once you exceed that threshold, then the size limit kicks in. And then, you know, so if you want to retain more than 5 gallons, you can't have any below 2.5 inches or whatever the size limit is. And then, you know, then you could cap it at a maximum. But you know, you set a threshold for when the size limit kicks in.
I'm just thinking of creative ways to handle this. Rather than try to do this with motions, let me suggest that we pass this motion. If everyone agrees with Bob's suggestion, let me ask that first. Anybody disagree with what Bob just suggested? It seemed like it was kind of a creative way of handling this. So I see everyone kind of nodding, but let's not do this just based on verbal commitments. My suggestion would be to pass this motion, and then the staff will write that up and circulate it to everyone within a few days, and see whether or not everybody still is in agreement after they look at it in writing. Any problem with that? So it's basically an option that's going to be folded in, but we give the discretion to the staff to draft it. Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have a problem with the suggestion. What I do have a problem with just approving the motion. We discussed it on the call. Maybe somebody else that was on the call can help me remember the last sentence there about fishing. If you're participating in the claw fishery, you can have no possession. Whole crabs are prohibited. That was something we discussed. I just can't remember who brought that up and what situation there was that I believe we decided that as long as the claws were still attached to the crab, then they didn't need to meet the minimum size that we would be requiring for a claw-only fishery. But the fisherman could bring both home. I think that's what we concluded on our call.
Megan?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember as well, Mike. I think what we said was that if you harvest at sea, you're basically held to a higher standard, so that you would have to meet that 2 3/4 inch minimum size. However, if you bring in whole crabs and then broke the claws off, you'd be held to the whole claw minimum size, or the whole crab minimum size. And so it's really a higher standard for that at sea harvest.
Pat?
I think Bob's suggestion is good, and I'm just wondering if under option C, we just get rid of this motion altogether, and then under option C, add one. I think we could add one sentence that says any amount of claws retained over a volumetric measure of 5 gallons would have to meet the minimum requirement. And you would make that change within the existing option C.
All right, so we get another suggestion here.
And then we can just put it in bed.
Anyone object to what Pat said? And are there any objections to that? If not, my suggestion is someone make a motion to postpone this motion indefinitely. We'll go back and revise the language the way you just said. Doug?
I'll make a motion to postpone this indefinitely.
All right, is there a second? Seconded by Mark Gibson. Any discussion? No discussion. Any disagreement with this? Any comments from anyone in the audience? No hands up any place? The motion to postpone indefinitely is passed by unanimous consent. So let's go back to the language, Pat, and make sure it's modified accordingly.
I think we just need to get, if we can get that language off. Option C is currently reads, under this option, claws may be detached and harvested at sea if they meet a minimum claw length of 2.75. I think it would say, under this option, if a volumetric measure of greater than 5 gallons is to be retained. The claws may be detached and harvested at sea as long as they meet a minimum claw length of 2.75. .75. What did I say? 5.7.
Okay, so this is a motion to add this language to option C, correct? Is there a second? A second? Seconded by Doug Grout. Discussion on it. Any discussion? Any hands up? No hands up? Anyone in the audience? No hands up. You ready for the question? All those, well, I'm not going to vote. No, any objection to adopting this by consent? Motion stands adopted by consent. Unanimous consent. Next, what other issues, Megan, do we need to discuss on this?
The bycatch definition. Oh, excuse me. The bycatch definition. So there's a proposal to add a second issue to this addendum to consider adding a definition for bycatch in the fishery.
All right, that language, can we put that language up? It's going to take 1 minute. So we'll put the language up, and then my suggestion is that I'll ask for whether or not we have any comments or questions on it, and I'm not sure we need to go into a detailed debate on it, but we do need to pass a motion to include it in the document if that's what our intent is. This is what happens when you move at light speed. Okay, so there's the language. Bob indicated that we do not need a motion. Do we have consent on this? Anyone object? Mike? No objection? You want to comment on it? Turn your microphone on, please.
Just a question under option B. Is there going to be anything written under this for the document to talk about claws versus weight of a whole crab versus, so if you have 20 pounds of claws, does that mean you need just 20 pounds of your targeted species or more? Or are we going to have some debate down the road where we have a comparison of the whole crab weight that you harvested the claws from? I just want to make sure that sometime in the future we've got that clarified, because I'm sure someone's going to ask.
Anyone want to comment on this? Dan?
If we don't clarify it, then it's a very liberal treatment, and that's something you can ratchet down later.
All right, so Doug?
Just one thing that I agree that something like this needs to be put in, but I also think it might be important to include in the document a definition of how we determine what the target species is. And as long as that's clear in the document, I think it can something that the states can implement.
Dan?
Yeah, I would request that the states who supported the 1,000 Jonah crab bycatch option in non-lobster trap fisheries, maybe they could give Megan a list of those trap types and those target species that is being caught? Because I think it's whelk. I think that was like the one example that seemed plausible, however unlikely. So in Massachusetts, we don't have that issue, so I think we're looking to the states in the mid.
All right, so Dan made a suggestion. The states that have been advocating this willing to work together and try to come up with that definition, provide it to Megan next week. Is that okay? Okay, so we don't need a motion on this. Is there any other? Are there any other changes? And if not, then we need a motion to approve this addendum as modified by the discussion today for public hearing. Bill Adler.
Also move what you just said.
Seconded by Mike. Any discussion on this? Ally.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've gone on the record a number of times at these meetings that NIMS is supportive of the Law Enforcement Committee's recommendation for a whole crab fishery, but at the same time we've also been supportive of this document having a wide range of alternatives for public consideration. Just one point of clarification to make sure my understanding is correct. The option, is it under option C, for the targeted fleet having a lobster permit, those vessels would be able to harvest an unlimited amount of claws, is that correct?
That's a good question, Allie. In the original way that option C was written, that answer would be yes, because it was only individuals under the permit or the bycatch limit that would be limited to the 2,000 claws. I think that would still remain true because you can still land greater than a 5-gallon bucket. So yes, those lobster permit holders are able to land an unlimited amount of claws.
Allie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could just follow up, I think one of the goals of the original FMP was, to preserve the Jonah crab fishery kind of as it stands today, and allow for these small historic harvest of claws to continue. So I guess that's just a little concerning to me that this option could potentially allow a vast expansion of the claw fishery.
Any further follow-up on this? Okay, none? Yeah, Megan just reminded me we actually had a motion to approve this addendum. So we have to go back and clear the record on this. Thank you, Megan. So
we just need to approve this as or amended to say as amended today.
Okay, so let me just, in the interest of time, does anyone have an objection to modifying this, perfecting this motion? Because I'm not sure we have the original motion maker and seconder in the room. So it would basically say move to approve draft addendum 2 to the Jonah crab FMP for public comment as modified by the comments and conclusions today. Any objection to doing that? No hands up, so it's adopted by consensus. Do we need to vote on this? I think not, since we have pretty much unanimous agreement. Anyone object to approving this motion? No objections. It's approved by unanimous consent. Next issue on the agenda is the FMP review. Megan?
All right, so while we pull up that presentation here, I'm doing the FMP review for the 2015 fishery. All right, so the lobster fishery has seen incredible expansion in effort and landings over the last 40 years. Coastwide landings in 2015 were 147 million pounds, which is equivalent to the landings in 2014 and just below the landings in 2013. The largest contributors to the fishery are Maine, seen here in blue, and Massachusetts, seen here in red, with 83% and 11% of landings respectively. Landings in descending order also occur in New Hampshire, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Connecticut, New York, Maryland, Delaware, and Virginia. The ex-vessel value for all lobster landings in 2015 was $617.7 million, which I believe is the largest on record, at least for the records that I have. In terms of status of the stock, the 2015 stock assessment indicated a mixed picture of the American lobster resource, with record high abundance through the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank and record low abundance throughout southern New England. The assessment found that the Gulf of Maine Georges Bank stock is not overfished and overfishing is not occurring. However, some of the population indicators for the young of year estimates were low, and this could be a sign of some recruitment, low recruitment in the future. We've talked extensively today about southern New England, so I won't go too much into that, but the stock is depleted. So for status of management, we are currently under Amendment 3, which created the 7 lobster conservation management areas you see here, as well as Addenda 1 through 24. The most recent addenda sought to align federal and state regulations regarding trap conservation taxes, trap transfer increments, and trap allocation for dual permit holders. We're currently working on Addendum 25 to respond to the poor condition of the southern New England stock. Addendum 18 established a series of trap reductions for LCMA 2 and 3, and the intent of this addendum was to scale the size of the southern New England fishery to the size of the resource. Per this addendum, states with fishermen in areas 2 and 3 are required to report on the degree of consolidation that has taken place. In total, 33,880 traps were retired in Area 2, and 8,663 traps were retired in Area 3. Addendum 10 requires 100% dealer reporting and 10% active harvester reporting, as well as port or sea sampling. Non-de minimis states are required to conduct fishery independent sampling through one of the following methods, which could be annual trawl survey, a ventless trap survey, or a young of year survey. I've put Maine's information up since I thought it might be appropriate for our meeting location. So just to orient everyone here, we have on the left the Young of Year survey, with 513 being in southern Maine and 511 being in northern Maine. And what you can see here is that all of these indices are below the average for that statistical area. On the right-hand side here is the Maine ventless trap survey. So the different colored bars are different years, with the rightmost bar being 2015. Again, as we move from 513 to 511, we get further north in Maine. And what we're seeing here is we haven't really seen the drastic reductions yet in the ventless trap survey. And I think this is something to keep an eye on, because if we do start to see reductions in this ventless trap survey, then that would corroborate what we're seeing in the Young of Year survey. In terms of compliance, all states are found to be in compliance with Amendment 3 and Addenda 1 through 24. For de minimis status, commercial landings in the two most recent years of data cannot exceed an average of 40,000 pounds. We received requests from Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Virginia and Delaware qualify. Maryland's 2-year average is slightly above the 40,000 pounds, so that can be open for discussion today. In terms of PRT recommendations, the PRT recommends full implementation of data collection programs, including increased harvester reporting and creation of a fixed gear VTR form. They recommend continued investigation in stock connectivity and larval transport between the inshore and offshore areas. The PRT noted several inconsistent regulations, notably that in Outer Cape Cod with the V-notch definition, and also noted that now that Gulf of Maine Georges Bank is a single biological unit, the board might want to consider the repercussions or potential options for consistent regulations in this area. And also, they're recommending improved enforcement of management measures, especially at sea enforcement of trap limits. And with that, I will take questions.
Questions for Megan? Any questions? No hands up. So I think what we need here is a motion to approve the FMP review, including de minimis status, and my suggestion is to include, I guess it's Maryland, in the de minimis category, because it's only very slightly over the limit and normally below the limit. I think it's a reasonable action. So somebody want to make that as a motion? Dan?
You want me to read that or just make the motion? All right, I make the motion. So moved.
Okay, seconded by Jim. Brandon. Brandon, you want to second this motion?
Yes, since this is my last meeting, I'll get my name up on the board. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I actually thought you wanted to propose a 12-inch minimum size for New Jersey. So we have a motion. Any discussion on it? Any Jim?
So, Mike, how much did the one guy actually harvest over the 40,000 pounds?
It's a bit of an embellishment. We have a couple guys that bring a few lobster in. I will say, since I have the mic, and I'll be quick, you know, while we have been harvesting we have been in de minimis status and have been hovering around that 40,000. I have dedicated some staff time for collection purposes to help better our understanding of the fishery down there. So we're doing what we can to collect information. We just can't do as much as what is required under the FMP.
Peter?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mike, not to put you on the spot, I just was wondering, is this something that's going to continue? Is it one particular vessel? I thought there was a vessel that came into Maryland and then it was no longer in Maryland anymore. Is that what happened? So you think that after this, because it's a 3-year average, that's why it's been over?
That's exactly it. We had a vessel that was fishing in Area 3, and he was bringing a lot of lobsters in. He's no longer part of the fishery, so that 3-year average is continuing to drop, in my understanding, and we expect it to be below 40,000 in the future.
All right. Any further discussion on this? Any objection? No objections. Motion stands approved by unanimous consensus. All right. So we're going to move on to the next issue, which is the Marine Monument. I think everyone knows the background here, but what we have not discussed is the letter from NOAA. So, Megan?
Yeah, so I'm just going to go over the facts that we know of so far. So it was designated on September 15th. It's over 100 miles southeast of Cape Cod, and it encompasses just under 5,000 square miles, some of which is shallower than 100 meters. It includes oceanographer Gilbert and Lydonia canyons, as well as some of the offshore seamounts. The red crab and lobster fisheries are allowed to continue fishing in the monument for 7 more years. However, other commercial fishing operations have 60 days to move their practices from within the monument, and recreational fishing is allowed within the boundaries.
Questions? Any questions? Yeah, I think it would be useful also to discuss the letter from NOAA. Peter, do you or somebody on the staff want to comment on this? And then if Mike, and then my suggestion is that if we can formalize a recommendation on this, I think it would be useful.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just so for the commission's, for the board's understanding, last Friday we sent out 3 letters, one each to the 2 councils, Mid-Atlantic and New England Council, and then one to the commission, basically informing all 3 bodies of current status of rulemaking or
Mike, can I stop you just for 1 second? Brandon, if you're going to sneak out of the room, I would just point out to everybody, this is his last meeting. And I think we owe him a debt of gratitude for all the work and dedication that he's put into serving the fisheries and fisheries in New Jersey. He's done a terrific job. He's been a fabulous guy to work with. I'm sorry to see him go, but I look forward to working with him on the Mid-Atlantic Council. So I suggest we give him a round of applause. Are you sure you don't want to propose a 12-inch minimum size for New Jersey? Just as a going away present?
I had been talking to Steve Hines quite a bit. He'd asked me to transfer all of New Jersey's quota to New York, so.
So we'll see you at the mid-meetings. Okay. Mike, I apologize. Please continue.
No problem, Mr. Chairman. Right, so the letters basically were to inform the three bodies as to where we are in terms of implementing regulations to enforce or implement the proclamation, the President's proclamation for the monument. And, you know, on the council side, under the Magnuson Act, we're obligated to work through the councils. So the letters to the two councils are essentially asking the two councils to take up amendments to their existing FMPs through which we would modify the regulations to implement the restrictions in the monument. And but also to let the councils know that if they decline to do so, then we would be obligated under the Magnuson Act to develop a secretarial amendments to the plans to implement those regulations. Then the letter to the commission was along the same lines, but informing the commission that because we don't have, you know, for lobster regulations, we implement those under 697 through Atlantic Coastal Act provisions, so that when we work either with the councils or through a secretarial plan, we will at the same time be planning to develop regulations for the lobster fishery that would obviously go into effect 7 years from the date of the proclamation for the trap fishery. And that during that process, we plan to consult with the commission, you know, on several occasions as we go through the development of that process. So that's a quick summary of the letter.
All right, thank you, Mike. Any questions for Mike? Anyone have a preference here? Doug?
I have a preference, if I can get an answer from Mike about one issue, and that is if the councils and the commissions prefer to have the NOAA Fisheries develop the plan, would you still consult with, I know you'd consult with the councils, but would you consult with the commission?
Yes, we would consult with the commission in all circumstances, because the process under the Atlantic Coastal Act for us to develop regulations for the lobster fishery, if not required, is certainly good practice to consult with the commission on those actions.
Then my recommendation, Mr. Chair, would be for the council to defer to NOAA Fisheries to develop the measures that are needed to implement the Antiquities Act as they apply to fisheries.
Any objections to that suggestion? No objections. So that'll be the course of action that's reflected in the minutes. I don't think we need a motion on it. Any further action on this issue? If not, we'll move on to the deep sea corals. Terry, are you going to give the report of Megan? Megan.
Sure, okay. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. So the New England Council is continuing to work on the Omnibus Deep Sea Coral Amendment, which could limit lobster traps. The document currently includes discrete zones, such as offshore canyons, and in Gulf of Maine, we have Jordan Basin, Mount Desert Rock, Linden Cole Knoll, and Outer Schoodic Ridge. At the September Council meeting, a 600-meter depth-based broad coral zone was added for consideration. There was also a motion to consider an exemption for the lobster and crab fisheries, and this passed, but what this means is that the option for limiting the trap fishery still exists, and so analysis on the lobster fishery will continue. ASMFC has been working with the council to provide data on potential impacts to the lobster fishery, and the TC has been consulting among themselves and also with staff from Maine DMR to plot catch and effort in the potentially affected areas. In talking with Michelle, it sounds like the tentative timeline for that is to have a document ready for public comment in the spring or summer of 2017. So I'm not sure how concrete that timeline is, but we'll keep you guys posted and let you know of any developments.
Any comments? Questions? Tony, you got your hand up? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The discussion of the corals and the need for information reminds me that when we were talking about reporting, you made the suggestion that states give recommendations back in the 1-month time period, which it made it sound like to me you're only talking about reporting that retained to the Southern New England addendum, but I believe what the working group was making a recommendation for was changes to reporting for coast-wide reporting. And so I didn't, with things like corals and ocean use, there's a lot of information that's being needed for us to give to the councils and to NOAA to be able to describe our lobster fishery and the impacts to that fishery. And so I wanted to know if we were going to look at reporting just for the Southern New England area or for all?
That's a good point, and actually I talked to Pat during the brief break. He needs a little bit of time to talk to his staff about various aspects of the data collection suggestions. So what I would suggest we do is not include data suggestions as part of this addendum that we're proceeding with. And at the February meeting, we'll have a discussion of whether or not we want to initiate addendum 26 and do it comprehensively. Is that agreeable? That'll give you a little bit of time, Pat, and then we'll compile all of the data collection changes in one document. Pat?
Just one question. In the working group report, I think they had made the suggestion of letting the TC take a look at what's a good percentage, and I think there possibly could have been some tiers for down the line, and is that something that we would want the TC to look at between now and February, or would you want them to wait until after February? And I would look to Pat.
Yeah, I think having that input from the TC to make sure, if it is 30%, that's fine, possibly fine. But I think getting that TC input as soon as we can, then I can try to put some numbers around it to see if it's doable. The state, one of the recommendations in the short term was the 10% focused on active harvesters within a 2-year period. We could implement that for the next fishing year, and could do that voluntarily outside of this if that would be beneficial.
Okay, so let's do this. If you want to make that suggestion during the next 1-month period, we'll consider it for this addendum. But all the rest of the suggestions we'll take up at the February meeting and see whether or not we want to initiate a draft addendum. Any objections to doing that? Okay, so no objection. Tony, are you getting heartburn?
I know, no objections. Just one more task for the TC to look at. Does the board want to have the TC also evaluate what we're actually collecting and what additional information might be informative as we move into this new expansion of ocean use and folks asking for information from us, at least to give us a list to consider and what it would mean to actually have to try to collect that information.
Megan?
I think the reporting work group kind of had that list, and there were TC members on that group, but we could run it by the TC and see if there are any others, yeah.
Objection to doing that? No objection. Okay, so it seems like we have a course of action. Pat, you can make your suggestion in terms of doing the quick fix to the main suggestion if that's what you want to do, and we'll consider that, and then we'll deal comprehensively with the data deficiencies at the February meeting, and that will take the form of initiating an addendum at that point.
Mr. Chairman, I think I could simply for the 2017 fishing year just tweak our 10% reporting without any action, as long as it's. Why can't we? Yeah, we can.
So I'm Kathleen Reardon. I'm the new TC chair, but I also work for Pat in Maine. And we do have some issues with our 10% because we lose the randomness. We also lose being able to track latency within the fishery. So we think we need to discuss it a little bit more before we commit to dropping anything other than the active harvesters.
I think that's consistent with what I offered. So Maine has the ability to recommend that if they would like after they do their internal consultations. And if they don't recommend it, it'll all get folded into the comprehensive data deficiency addendum. Okay? Everyone clear?
It's clear as mud, because if that's the case, then the TC needs to comment on that. I would like that from the TC. No offense to my staff.
Yeah.
The TC is going to have to look at the 10% change that was listed for the short term as well as the 30%.
Okay, so Megan, you've got a charge for the TC. Bill Adler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is back on the closed area things, and I've already talked to you about a petition that's been put in to make Hudson Canyon a sanctuary. I'm not sure where that is in the middle of all the little dots and stuff. If that's an additional area to the monument area and the coral area, and now an environmental group had put in for a sanctuary on Hudson Canyon. I just wanted that noted.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, for noting that. Actually, it's 3 canyons. There are 3 canyons that all in the Mid-Atlantic area that I think have been proposed. And my suggestion is let the staff get the information on that and then present whatever information they can get on that at the next meeting. Any objections to handling that? Okay, so anything further on corals? If not, let's see, any other business before the board? If not, I'd just like to personally thank, Doug, I was going to thank our hosts, but I'd also like, while I've got the mic, before Doug flicks it off, I would like to thank the members of the PDT for all the work they put into the document. Although it didn't go out the door today, I think that the first part of the document I thought was one of the better documents that's been written by the PDT. It's clear, it's concise, it lays out all the facts. I think it's very well written. You know, we can just tweak those sections that go behind it, and I'm sure at the February meeting we'll get it out the door. But thank you very much for all your labors. Doug.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I also wanted to thank all the commissioners for hard work this week. It was a long and very, I think, productive week in what we did. And if any of you happen to be staying over tonight, and that includes any staff, I'm going to open up my room at about 4:30 today for a little hospitality suite. It's room 2077, and it's going to be BYOB and BYO snacks.
Any other business? Peter?